The cinnamon rolls were rising on the counter, covered with a clean dish towel, when Claire walked into the kitchen and set her purse down with a thud that was heavier than the bag itself. She had driven 2 hours from the city, and I had spent the morning getting ready, sweeping the floor, wiping down the stove, pulling out the good plates. She was 32 now, and she still had that way of filling a room without saying a word. I smiled at her and asked if she wanted coffee. She said, "Mom, sit down." I kept my hands busy with the icing bowl. "I'll sit in a minute. Let me just finish this." "Mom, please." Her voice had an edge I had not heard in years, not since she was a teenager and wanted something she knew I would not give her. I put down the whisk and wiped my hands on my apron. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. The afternoon sun was coming through the window, catching the dust in the air, and I noticed she was wearing a blazer. She never wore blazers to visit me. She dressed like she was going to a board meeting. She took a breath. She said, "I'm putting the house on the market." I did not say anything at first. I thought maybe I had misheard her. The house was a 2-story colonial with a cracked driveway and a maple tree in the backyard that had been there since before we moved in. We had raised our children in that house. Claire had learned to ride a bike on that driveway. Marcus had carved his initials into the garage door frame when he was 12, and I had never painted over them. I looked at Claire and I said, "What did you say?" "The house. I'm going to list it. I've already spoken to a realtor." "You spoke to a realtor about my house?" "It's not just your house, Mom. It's Dad's house too." And he agreed. I heard the words, but I could not connect them to anything real. Frank was in the living room, I knew, because I could hear the television on low. He always kept it on the financial news channel, even on weekends, even when nobody was watching. I looked toward the doorway and then back at Claire. I said, "Your father would never agree to that without talking to me first." She did not flinch. She said, "He did agree. We talked about it 2 weeks ago. He said he was tired of maintaining the property. He said the taxes were too high. He said he wanted to downsize." I felt something cold moving through my chest. I stood up and walked to the doorway. Frank was in his armchair, the one with the worn armrests, holding the newspaper open, but not really reading it. He had his reading glasses on, perched low on his nose. The television was muted. I said, "Frank." He looked up. He knew. I could see it in his face, the way he looked down again quickly, the way his fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. I said, "Claire says you want to sell the house." He did not answer right away. Then he folded the paper and put it on the side table. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He said, "We need to talk about it, Ellen." "We need to talk about it," I repeated. "You and Claire already talked about it. I am just finding out now." Claire came up behind me. She put her hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. She said, "Mom, don't make this into a fight. Dad is trying to do what's best for both of you." "What is best for me is being asked," I said. "What is best for me is not having my daughter and my husband make decisions about my home behind my back." Frank stood up. He was not a tall man, but he had always carried himself with a steady kind of gravity. Now he looked smaller. He said, "Ellen, I was going to tell you. I just needed to find the right moment. The right moment was 2 weeks ago, when you were having this conversation with Claire." "Claire brought it up," he said. "She had some good points. The house is too big for us now. We don't need 4 bedrooms. We don't need the yard work." "The yard work has not killed you yet," I said. "And you have not complained about it once in 35 years. Claire stepped between us. She said, "Mom, the market is good right now. We could get a really solid price. You and Dad could move to something smaller, something easier to manage. You could even rent a nice apartment in town and not have to worry about maintenance ever again." I looked at her. I looked at her blazer and her sharp haircut and her hands on her hips, like she was presenting a proposal to a client. I said, "Do you know how many nights I lay awake in this house, worrying about you when you were a teenager? Do you know how many times I sat in that kitchen and cried because I thought I was failing as a mother? This house is not a piece of real estate. This house is my life." Claire's face softened for a moment, but then she hardened again. She said, "That's exactly what I'm trying to say. You deserve a life that is easier. You deserve to not have to worry about the roof or the furnace or the property tax increases. You deserve to travel. You and Dad should be enjoying your retirement, not stuck here. I am not stuck, I said. I am home. Frank said, Ellen, I'm tired. I turned to him. His face was gray in the afternoon light. He said, I'm tired of the lawn. I'm tired of the snow. I'm tired of the repairs. I'm just tired. Claire is trying to help us. She is trying to help herself, I said, and I did not know why I said it, but it came out like the truth. Claire stepped back. Her eyes went narrow. She said, what is that supposed to mean? It means you have not visited us in 2 months. It means you show up today with a realtor's name and a plan and no warning. It means you have already decided what is going to happen, and you just expect me to fall in line. I am doing this because I love you, she said. No, I said. You are doing this because you want to control something. I don't know what it is, but it is not love. She grabbed her purse from the table. She said, fine. If you're going to be like that, I'll leave. Frank said, Claire, wait. But she was already walking out the door. She slammed it behind her. I heard her car start and then the sound of gravel as she pulled out of the driveway. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the cinnamon rolls, still rising under the towel. They had not changed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Frank sat back down in his armchair. He did not pick up his newspaper. He stared at the muted television. I walked over and stood in front of him. I said, tell me the truth. What is really going on? He did not answer. I said, you have never wanted to sell this house. You have never even mentioned it. You talked about painting the shutters last month. You talked about replacing the gutters. You do not talk about gutters if you are planning to sell a house. He rubbed his face with both hands. He said, I got a letter from work. What kind of letter? A separation letter. I sat down on the ottoman in front of him. I said, separation. Like divorce. Like early retirement. They're offering a package. They're reorganizing the department. I said, Frank, you are 61. You have been at that company for over 20 years. They cannot just push you out. They can, he said. They are. They merged my division with another team out of state. My position is redundant. They offered me a project-based contract, but that means no guaranteed hours, no benefits, no security. The separation package is better. I felt the air go out of me. I said, why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, he said. Because I didn't want you to look at me like I was a failure. I have never looked at you like that. You would have, he said. Not on purpose. But you would have seen it in your eyes. The disappointment. The worry. I couldn't bear it. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold. I said, we are not selling the house. He looked at me. He said, Ellen. We are not selling the house, I said again. We will find another way. There is no other way, he said. The mortgage is more than we can afford on my package. And I don't have it in me to look for another job. Who is going to hire a 61-year-old accountant with outdated skills? You are not outdated, I said. You are experienced. There is a difference. He shook his head. He said, I already agreed to Claire. I told her we would go along with it. I didn't know how to tell you. I stood up. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the cinnamon rolls. I lifted the towel and punched the dough down. I did it harder than I needed to. Frank came to the doorway. He said, what are you doing? I am making dinner, I said. We are going to eat, and then I am going to call Marcus. Marcus doesn't need to be involved in this. He is my son, I said. He is already involved. He just doesn't know it yet. I called Marcus that night after Frank went to bed. He answered on the second ring, which was unusual. He was usually working late or had his phone on silent. I said, Marcus, it's your mother. He said, I know. I saw your name. Is everything okay? No, I said. Everything is not okay. Your father is being pushed out of his job, and your sister is trying to sell our house. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, Claire is trying to sell the house? She already has a realtor. She already has a plan. She told me today, and your father agreed to it without telling me. He said, that doesn't sound like Dad. It doesn't sound like any of us, I said. But it's happening. I need to know what you think. Another pause. He said, Mom, I trust your judgment. That is not an answer. I know, he said. I just don't know what to say. I've got a lot going on right now. What kind of a lot? I said. The usual. Work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. Marcus, you're my son. I worry about you whether you tell me to or not. He sighed. I could hear it through the phone, that long, tired exhale. He said, I have a meeting in the morning. I need to get some sleep. Can we talk about this later? I said, we can talk about it tomorrow. But I am not going to let this go, Marcus. I am going to fight this. He said, I know you will, Mom. You always do. He hung up. I sat in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and looked out the window at the dark yard. The maple tree was just a shadow against the sky. I thought about all the years I had spent in this house, all the meals I had cooked, all the laundry I had folded, all the fights I had mediated between Claire and Marcus, all the nights I had stayed up waiting for Frank to come home from work. I thought about the way Claire had looked at me today, like I was an obstacle to be removed. I thought about the way Frank had looked at me, like he was already gone. I put the phone down and went to the drawer where I kept the household files. I pulled out the mortgage statement. I pulled out the tax records. I pulled out the bank statements. I spread them on the table and I started to add the numbers. The mortgage was high, but it was not impossible. We had savings. We had Frank's pension. We had my small retirement account from my years of part-time work before the children were born. I realized that Frank had not been entirely honest. The mortgage was not the problem. The problem was that he had given up. I folded the papers and put them back in the drawer. I walked through the living room and looked at the photographs on the mantel. There was one of Claire and Marcus at the beach when they were small, their faces smeared with sunscreen and sand. There was one of Frank and me on our wedding day, both of us so young we did not know what we were doing. I looked at my own face in the glass of the photograph frame. I was not the same woman who had married Frank all those years ago. I was older, and I was tired, and I was angry. But I was still here. And I was not leaving. I went upstairs and got into bed. Frank was asleep, his back turned to me. I lay there in the dark and listened to him breathe. It was the same sound I had listened to for 35 years, the same rhythm, the same steady presence. But there was something different now. Something had broken. I did not know if it could be fixed, but I knew that I could not fix it by pretending everything was fine. I closed my eyes and thought about the next day. I would call Claire again. I would call Marcus again. I would sit down with Frank and I would make him tell me everything, all of it, every piece of the story he had been hiding. And then I would figure out what to do. I was not a businesswoman. I was not a lawyer. I was just a mother and a wife. But that had to count for something. It had to. The morning came too soon. I woke up before Frank, the way I always did, and I went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was quiet. The cinnamon rolls were still on the counter, covered with the towel. I had not baked them the night before. I had been too angry. I lifted the towel and looked at the dough. It had not risen any further. It had dried out a little on top. I thought about throwing it away, but I did not. I punched it down one more time and shaped it into rolls and put them in the pan. I turned on the oven. While the oven was heating, I dialed Claire's number. She did not answer. I left a message. I said, we need to talk. Not about the house. About your father. About what is really going on. Call me back. I hung up and looked at the phone for a long moment. Then I dialed Marcus again. He answered this time, his voice rough and tired. I said, I need you to tell me the truth. What is going on with you? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Jenna left me. She took Liam and she left. I've been living alone for 3 months. I closed my eyes. I said, why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you would worry, he said. And I didn't want to add to your problems. You are not a problem, I said. You are my son. And you are coming home this weekend. We are going to talk about this. All of us. He said, Mom, I don't think I can. You can, I said. And you will. I am not going to let this family fall apart. Not while I am still standing. I hung up. The oven was beeping, ready for the rolls. I opened the door and slid the pan in. I stood there, watching the heat rise through the glass, and I felt something stir in me. It was not hope. It was something harder than that. It was the same thing I had felt when Claire was born and I was terrified and exhausted and had no idea what I was doing. It was the same thing I had felt when Marcus broke his arm, and we had to drive 30 miles to the nearest hospital in the middle of the night. It was the thing that got me through. It was the refusal to let go. I waited until Frank left for work on Monday morning before I went into the garage. He had been quiet all weekend, moving through the house like a ghost, not meeting my eyes. We had eaten dinner in near silence. I had asked him once if he wanted to talk, and he had said, "Not right now," and that had been the end of it. I did not push. I had learned over the years that pushing Frank only made him retreat further. So I waited. And when I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I went to the garage. The garage was cluttered in the way that garages always are. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old gardening tools, a bicycle that had not been ridden in a decade. Frank's briefcase was on a shelf near the workbench. He always left it there when he came home, and he always took it with him in the morning. But on Fridays, sometimes he forgot to bring it inside. I had seen him leave it there countless times. I had never opened it. I had never had a reason to. I pulled it down and set it on the workbench. It was a worn leather briefcase, the same one he had carried for as long as I could remember. The clasp was loose. I opened it. Inside were the usual things: a calculator, a few pens, a notepad with scribbled numbers. There was also a manila folder, thick and dog-eared. I took it out. The folder was labeled with his name and his employee ID number. I opened it. The first page was a letter on company letterhead. Caldwell Logistics. I had seen that logo 1,000 times, on Frank's pay stubs, on his business cards, on the coffee mugs he brought home from company picnics. The letter was dated 3 months ago. It was addressed to Frank, and it began with the words, "Dear valued employee." I read the letter twice. It was not an early retirement offer. It was a notice of organizational restructuring. The language was formal and careful, full of corporate euphemisms. They were consolidating departments. They were streamlining operations. They were offering a voluntary separation package to employees in certain positions. Frank's position was listed. The letter made it clear that the package was optional, but it also made it clear that there would be no guarantee of employment beyond the end of the fiscal year. I felt my hands start to shake. I put the letter down and took a breath. The garage smelled like gasoline and dust. I leaned against the workbench and closed my eyes. Frank had lied to me. Not about the package, but about the reason. He had told me he wanted to retire. He had made it sound like a choice. But it was not a choice. He was being pushed out. They were making him feel like he had no other option. And Claire had capitalized on that. I folded the letter and put it back in the folder. I put the folder back in the briefcase. I closed the clasp and put the briefcase back on the shelf. I walked back into the house and sat down at the kitchen table. I looked at the clock. It was 9 in the morning. I had the whole day ahead of me, and I did not know what to do with it. I thought about calling Frank at work. I thought about driving to his office and demanding to speak to his supervisor. But I knew that would only make things worse. Frank was a proud man. He would not want me to fight his battles for him. And yet, I could not sit still. I could not pretend that I had not seen what I had seen. I got up and started cleaning the kitchen. I washed the dishes from breakfast. I wiped down the counters. I swept the floor. I was doing what I always did when I was upset. I was keeping my hands busy. But my mind was racing. I thought about all the years Frank had given to that company. The late nights. The weekends he had gone in to catch up on work. The vacations we had canceled because he could not get away. He had given them everything, and now they were discarding him like a piece of old equipment. When Frank came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. He walked in and hung up his coat. He looked tired, the way he always looked these days. He said, "How was your day?" I said, "I found the letter." He stopped. He was standing in the middle of the room, his hand still on the coat rack. He said, "What letter?" "The letter from Caldwell. The one about the restructuring. I found it in your briefcase." He did not say anything for a long time. He walked over and sat down on the couch. He put his head in his hands. He said, "Ellen, I'm sorry." "You lied to me," I said. "You told me you wanted to retire. You told me it was your choice." "It was my choice," he said. "They gave me a choice. Stay on a project-by-project basis with no guaranteed hours, or take the package. I chose the package. You chose it because they made you feel like you had no other option. That's not true. It is true, I said. I read the letter. I know what they were doing. They were pushing you out, and you let them. He looked up at me. His eyes were red. He said, "What was I supposed to do, Ellen? Fight them? Go to HR and make a scene? They would have fired me anyway. At least this way I get something." "You get a fraction of what you deserve," I said. "You have given them 20 years. You have given them your health. You have given them your time. And they're giving you a pat on the back and a door out." He stood up. He said, "You don't understand. You've never worked in a place like that. You don't know how it works." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Make me understand. Because right now, all I see is my husband being pushed out of his job and my daughter trying to sell our house out from under us." He walked to the window. He stood there, looking out at the yard. He said, "It's complicated." "I don't care if it's complicated," I said. "I'm your wife. You are supposed to tell me things. You are supposed to let me help you." "I didn't want you to help me," he said. "I wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From this," he said, turning around. "From the humiliation. From the worry. From having to look at me and see a man who couldn't hold on to his job." I walked over to him. I put my hand on his arm. I said, "Frank, I am not going to look at you differently because you lost your job. You didn't lose it. They took it from you. And that is not your fault." He shook his head. He said, "You don't know that." "I know you," I said. "I know you are a good man. I know you are a hard worker. I know you have never done anything to deserve this." He pulled away from me. He said, "I need some air." He walked out the back door. I watched him go. He walked to the end of the yard and stood under the maple tree. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed. I wanted to go out to him, but I knew he needed space. So I stayed inside. I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. The next weekend, Claire came back. She did not call first. She just showed up. She walked in the door with a box of files and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in the mirror. She set the box on the kitchen table and said, "I brought some things for you to look at." I said, "What things?" She opened the box. Inside were brochures from real estate agencies, market analysis reports, photographs of houses that were for sale in the area. She said, "I want you to see what we could get. The market is really strong right now. We could get top dollar for this place." I looked at the brochures. I looked at the photographs of shiny kitchens and spacious living rooms. I looked at Claire's face, so eager and so sure of herself. I said, "Claire, I told you. I am not selling this house." She said, "Mom, I know you're upset. But you need to think about this practically. Dad is not going to be able to afford the mortgage on his own. And you can't afford it on what you make at that part-time job." I said, "How do you know about my job?" "Dad told me," she said. "He said you started working at some accounting office." "Mom, you're almost 60. You shouldn't be working data entry for minimum wage." "I am working because I need to," I said. "And I am working because I want to. I want to contribute. I want to show your father that we can get through this without selling everything we have worked for." Claire sat down at the table. She pushed the brochures aside. She said, "Mom, I don't think you understand what's happening. Dad is not going to find another job. He's too old. He's too set in his ways. And he's not going to be able to keep up with the payments on this house. If we don't sell now, we're going to lose it anyway. We're going to lose it to the bank, and we'll get nothing." I sat down across from her. I said, "Why do you care so much about this?" She looked away. She said, "Because I care about you." That is not the whole truth. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Derek and I are looking at an investment property. A new development in the city. It's a really good opportunity, but we need capital. The sale of this house would give us enough to get in on the ground floor." I stared at her. I said, "So this is not about us. This is about you." "It's about both," she said. "I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm trying to build a future. And part of that future is helping you and Dad have a comfortable retirement. By selling our home and giving you the money." "It's not giving me the money," she said. "It's an investment. You would get a return." I said, "Claire, I don't want a return. I want to stay in my home. I want to wake up in the same bedroom I have woken up in for 35 years. I want to cook in the same kitchen where I taught you how to make cookies. I want to sit in the same living room where your father proposed to me. You cannot put a price on that. She looked at me with something like pity. She said, Mom, that's sentimentality. It's not practical. I don't care if it's practical, I said. It's my life. And I am not going to let you take it away from me. She stood up. She said, Fine. If you won't listen to me, I'll talk to Dad again. He's more reasonable than you are. She walked out of the kitchen. I heard her go into the living room, where Frank was watching television. I heard her talking to him, her voice low and insistent. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the murmur of their voices. I could not make out the words, but I knew what she was saying. She was telling him that I was being unreasonable. She was telling him that he needed to make me see reason. After a while, Claire came back into the kitchen. She said, Dad is on my side. He's going to talk to you again. I said, Did you show him the brochures? She nodded. He liked the one with the 2-bedroom condo. He said it looked easy to maintain. Of course he did, I said. Because he is tired. And because you are telling him exactly what he wants to hear. She said, Mom, I'm not the enemy here. I'm trying to help. Then listen to me, I said. Listen to what I am telling you. I do not want to leave this house. I do not want to live in a condo. I do not want to downsize. I want to stay right here, in the place where I raised you and your brother. And I want you to respect that. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I'll give you some time to think about it. She left. The front door closed behind her. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the brochures. I picked them up and carried them to the trash can. I dropped them in. I watched them fall. Then I went to the living room. Frank was still sitting in his armchair. The television was still on. He did not look at me when I walked in. I said, Frank, we need to talk. He said, I'm tired, Ellen. I know you're tired, I said. But we need to talk. We need to figure out what we are going to do. He said, Claire has a point. The house is too big for us. We don't need all this space. I sat down on the couch. I said, Do you remember the day we moved in? Do you remember how we sat on the front steps and watched the sun go down and talked about all the things we were going to do? You said you were going to build a tree house for the kids. You said you were going to plant a garden. Do you remember? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I remember. We built a life here, I said. We made this house a home. And now you want to throw it away because you are tired and because Claire has convinced you it's the easy way out. He said, It's not about easy. It's about survival. I can't afford this house on my own. You are not on your own, I said. I am here. I am working. I am trying. And I am not going to give up. He finally looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. He said, I don't want to give up. I just don't know how to keep going. I moved to the armchair and knelt in front of him. I took his hands. I said, Then we will figure it out together. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. We do not let each other fall. He looked at me. He nodded, just a little. He said, Okay. I stayed there, holding his hands. I could feel the tremor in them. He was afraid. He was afraid of the future, afraid of losing everything, afraid of being seen as a failure. I understood that fear. I felt it too. But I was not going to let it win. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed next to Frank, listening to him breathe, and I thought about all the things that had happened in the past few months. The letter from Caldwell. Claire's campaign to sell the house. Marcus's silence. I realized that I had been so focused on my own anger and hurt that I had not been paying attention to the people around me. Frank had been suffering alone. Claire had been trying to solve a problem she did not understand. And Marcus had been pulling away for reasons I had not bothered to ask about. I got up and went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was groggy. He said, Mom? It's late. I said, I know. I'm sorry. I just needed to hear your voice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is everything okay? I don't know, I said. I don't know if everything is okay. But I want to talk to you. I want to know what is going on with you. I want to know why you have been so distant. He said, Mom, I told you. I've just been busy. That is not the truth, I said. I am your mother. I know when you are lying. He let out a long breath. He said, it's complicated. Everything is complicated, I said. But that does not mean we don't talk about it. That does not mean we pretend everything is fine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Jenna left me. She took Liam. I've been trying to get her to come back, but she won't. She says I'm not the same person she married. I closed my eyes. I said, Marcus, I am so sorry. It's my fault, he said. I was working too much. I was never home. She got tired of waiting. That is not entirely your fault, I said. You were working to support your family. You were doing what you thought was right. It doesn't matter what I thought, he said. She's gone. And Liam is gone. And I don't know how to fix it. I said, you don't have to fix it alone. That is what family is for. He started to cry. I could hear it in his voice, the crack, the catch. I said, it's okay. I'm here. I'm always here. We talked for a long time. He told me about the arguments, the late nights, the loneliness. He told me about the empty apartment and the toys he had bought for Liam that were still in their packages. He told me about the divorce papers he had been served last week. I listened. I did not interrupt. I just listened. When we finally hung up, the sky was starting to lighten. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the sun come up through the window. I felt tired and sad and angry, but I also felt something else. I felt a resolve. I was not going to let my family fall apart. I was not going to let Claire sell our house. I was not going to let Frank give up. And I was not going to let Marcus disappear into his grief. I got up and started the coffee. There was a lot to do. I drove to the city on a Tuesday morning. The weather was gray and damp, the kind of day that made everything look washed out. I had told Frank I was going to run errands. I did not tell him I was going to see Marcus. He would have asked too many questions, and I did not have the energy for questions. I just needed to see my son with my own eyes. The drive took 2 hours. I had been to Marcus's apartment once before, right after he moved in. That was before Jenna left, before everything fell apart. I remembered it being small but tidy, with a sofa and a coffee table and pictures on the walls. I did not know what to expect this time. I found the building on a side street off the main road. It was an older building, 3 stories, with a cracked sidewalk and a buzzer that did not work. I pushed the door open and walked up the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallways smelled like cooking oil and stale air. I knocked on the door with the number 2B. Marcus opened it. He looked like he had not slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair was uncombed, and there was a shadow on his jaw that suggested he had not shaved in a while. He looked at me and said, Mom, what are you doing here? I came to see you, I said. Are you going to let me in? He stepped aside. I walked into the apartment. It was smaller than I remembered and darker. The curtains were drawn. There were dishes in the sink, a pile of laundry on the floor, and in the corner, a stack of toys still in their packaging. I looked at those toys and felt something twist in my chest. I said, Marcus, when did you last eat a proper meal? He shrugged. I've been busy. Busy doing what? Working. Trying to get things sorted out. You know. I walked over to the kitchen counter. There was a box of cereal, a carton of milk that was probably expired, and a half-empty pot of coffee that looked like it had been there for days. I opened the refrigerator. It was nearly empty. A few eggs, some wilted lettuce, a jar of pickles. I closed the door. I said, sit down. I'm going to make you something to eat. You don't have to do that, Mom. Sit down, I said again. I am not going to argue with you. He sat down at the small table by the window. I found a pan in the cupboard and some oil in the cabinet. I cracked the eggs into a bowl and whisked them. I found some bread in the freezer and put it in the toaster. While I was cooking, I looked around the apartment. There were boxes everywhere, some open, some still sealed. There was a stack of mail on the table unopened. There was a photograph of Jenna and Liam on the shelf, face down. I put the plate of eggs and toast in front of him. I said, eat. He picked up his fork and took a bite. He chewed slowly, like he had forgotten what food tasted like. I sat across from him and waited. After a few minutes, he said, I know I should have called. Yes, I said. You should have. I didn't know what to say. You could have started with the truth. You could have told me you were struggling. He put down his fork. He said, I didn't want you to worry. I know you have enough on your plate with Dad and Claire and the house. That is not your concern, I said. My plate is my plate. I can handle it. What I cannot handle is my son disappearing on me. He looked down at his plate. He said, I'm sorry. Don't apologize, I said. Just talk to me. Tell me what happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Jenna said I was never there. She said I was always working, always on my phone, always thinking about the next shift. She said she felt like a single mother even though I was living in the same house. I said, were you working that much? I had to, he said. The rent was high. The bills were high. I was trying to give them a good life. I was trying to give Liam everything I didn't have when I was growing up. And what did you have growing up? He looked at me. He said, I had you. And Dad. And a home that was always there. I reached across the table and took his hand. I said, then you know what matters. It is not the money. It is not the things. It is being present. It is showing up. He pulled his hand away. He said, I know that now. But it's too late. It is not too late, I said. Liam is still your son. Jenna is still his mother. You can still find a way to be in his life. She doesn't want me in his life, he said. She said I was a bad influence. She said I was too stressed all the time, and it was affecting Liam. She said she didn't want him to grow up like that. I felt a flash of anger, but I pushed it down. I said, did she say that, or did you imagine it? She said it, he said. She said it to the lawyer. I have the papers. He got up and walked over to a box on the floor. He pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to me. I opened it. Inside were legal documents, formal and cold. I read through the first few pages. It was a custody petition. Jenna was asking for full custody. She was alleging that Marcus was emotionally unstable and unable to provide a stable environment for Liam. I put the papers back in the envelope. I said, Marcus, this is not the end. This is the beginning of a fight. And you are not going to fight it alone. He sat back down. He put his head in his hands. He said, I don't have the money for a lawyer. I don't have the energy for a fight. I just want my son back. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. I pulled the curtain aside and looked out at the street below. There were people walking by, going about their lives, not knowing or caring about the pain in this apartment. I turned back to Marcus. I said, I am going to stay here for a few days. I am going to clean this place up. I am going to make sure you eat properly. And then we are going to figure out what to do. You can't stay here, he said. Dad needs you. Dad can manage on his own for a few days, I said. Right now, you need me more. He did not argue. I think he was too tired to argue. I found a cloth in the kitchen and started wiping down the counter. I filled the sink with hot water and washed the dishes. I picked up the laundry and put it in a bag to take to the laundromat. I opened the curtains and let in the light. Marcus watched me for a while. Then he said, you don't have to do all this. I said, I know I don't have to. I want to. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I worked quietly, moving through the apartment like I had moved through my own home for 35 years. There was something comforting about the routine, the small acts of care. It gave me something to focus on while my mind churned with worry. That evening, I called Frank. He answered on the second ring. I said, I am staying at Marcus's for a few days. He needs me. Frank said, what happened? I told him about Jenna, about the custody papers, about the state of the apartment. I told him that Marcus had been hiding this from us for months. Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I should come down. No, I said. You need to stay there. You need to handle Claire. She's been calling, he said. She wants to know when we can sign the papers for the realtor. I felt my jaw tighten. I said, tell her we are not signing anything. Tell her we need more time. She's not going to like that. I don't care what she likes, I said. She is not the one who gets to make this decision. Frank said, Ellen, I don't know how much longer I can hold her off. She's very determined. I know she is, I said. That is why I need you to be strong. Can you do that for me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll try. Good, I said. I'll call you tomorrow. I hung up and looked at Marcus. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, which was not turned on. I sat down next to him. I said, how long has it been since you talked to your father? He shrugged. A few weeks. You should call him, I said. He needs to hear your voice. He doesn't want to hear my voice. He's got enough problems. Your father loves you, I said. He may not say it, but he loves you. And he is worried about you, even if he does not show it. Marcus said, I don't know how to talk to him. We've never been good at that. Then start now, I said. Start small. Call him and tell him you are okay. That is enough for now. He looked at me. He said, you are good at this. The fixing things. I am not fixing anything, I said. I am just trying to keep us all from falling apart. There is a difference. The next morning, I went to the laundromat. I sat in the plastic chair and watched the clothes go around in the machines. I thought about Claire and her realtor and her investment property. I thought about Frank and his letter from Caldwell. I thought about Marcus and his empty apartment. I felt like I was holding the threads of all these problems in my hands, and if I let go, they would all unravel. When I got back to the apartment, Marcus was on the phone. He was talking to someone in a low voice. I hung up my coat and waited. When he got off the phone, he said, that was Jenna. I said, what did she want? She wants to meet. She says she wants to talk about custody without the lawyers. That is good, I said. That is progress. It's not progress, he said. She wants to talk because she wants me to give up. She wants me to sign away my rights. I said, did she say that? Not in so many words. But I know her. I know what she is thinking. Then do not meet her alone, I said. If you are going to meet her, I am going with you. Mom, you can't do that. I said, watch me. We met Jenna at a coffee shop near her apartment. She was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table by the window with a cup of tea. She was dressed nicely, her hair done, her makeup perfect. She looked like she had stepped out of a magazine. I had always liked Jenna. She had been good for Marcus. But now, looking at her, I saw a stranger. We sat down across from her. She looked at me and said, Ellen, I didn't expect you to come. I said, I am here for my son. She nodded. She looked at Marcus. She said, thank you for agreeing to meet. Marcus said, what do you want, Jenna? She took a breath. She said, I want to make this as easy as possible. For everyone. I don't want to drag this out in court. I don't want to make this ugly. Marcus said, so you want me to sign the papers? I want you to do what is best for Liam, she said. He needs stability. He needs consistency. He needs to know that his home is safe and that the people in it are not going to disappear. I have never disappeared on him, Marcus said. I have always been there. Physically, maybe, Jenna said. But mentally, emotionally, you were always somewhere else. You were always thinking about work, about money, about your problems. You never really saw him. Marcus looked down at the table. I could see his hands shaking. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. I said, Jenna, I understand that you are upset. I understand that things were not perfect. But Marcus is a good father. He loves Liam. And he wants to be part of his life. I know he loves him, Jenna said. But love is not enough. Love does not pay the rent. Love does not make you present. Love does not fix the fact that he was never there. She looked at me. She said, Ellen, I know you want to protect him. I know you want to believe he is the good man you raised. But he is not the same person anymore. He is angry. He is bitter. He is so focused on his own pain that he cannot see how it is affecting everyone around him. I felt my own anger rising. I said, he is struggling because his wife left him and took his son. He is struggling because he is alone and afraid. And instead of helping him, you are punishing him. I am not punishing him, Jenna said. I am protecting my son. Marcus stood up. He said, I can't do this. He walked out of the coffee shop. I looked at Jenna. I said, I hope you are happy. She said, I'm not happy, Ellen. I'm just doing what I have to do. I stood up and followed Marcus. He was standing outside, leaning against the wall, his face in his hands. I walked up to him and put my hand on his back. I said, it's okay. We're going to figure this out. He said, she's right. She's right about everything. I was never there. I was never present. I was always thinking about the next thing, the next problem, the next pill. I missed everything. I said, then change it. You cannot change the past. But you can change the future. How, he said. She won't let me near Liam. She has all the power. Then you fight, I said. You get a lawyer. You go to court. You show them that you are a good father who made mistakes, but is willing to do better. I don't have the money for a lawyer. Then I will help you, I said. We will find a way. He looked at me. He said, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep trying to fix everything? I said, because you are my son. And I will never stop trying. We walked back to the apartment in silence. I made him a cup of tea and sat with him on the couch. He did not say much. He just sat there, staring at the wall. I stayed with him, not talking, not pushing. I just stayed. That night, I called Frank. I told him about the meeting with Jenna. I told him about Marcus's despair. I told him that I was going to stay a little longer. He said, Ellen, I need you here. I said, I know. But Marcus needs me more right now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what about the house? Claire is coming by again this weekend. Tell her to wait, I said. Tell her I will talk to her when I get back. She's not going to wait, Ellen. She's already made an appointment with the realtor for next week. I closed my eyes. I said, Frank, you need to stand up to her. You need to tell her no. I don't know how to tell her no, he said. She's our daughter. She's trying to help. She is trying to help herself, I said. And if you let her do this, we will lose everything. I hung up and looked at Marcus, who was asleep on the couch. I covered him with a blanket. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about Frank, alone in the house, facing Claire and her realtor. I thought about Marcus, sleeping on the couch, facing a legal battle he could not afford. I thought about myself, standing in the middle, trying to hold it all together. I did not know how I was going to fix everything. I did not know if I could. But I knew I was not going to give up. I was not going to let my family fall apart. Not while I still had breath in my body. I sat down in the chair by the window and watched the night go by. I was tired. I was so tired. But I was still here. And that had to count for something. I started the job on a Monday. The accounting office was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a pizza place. The sign on the door said Precision Bookkeeping in gold lettering that was starting to peel. I had worn my best blouse, the one with the small floral pattern, and I had ironed it twice. I had also put on a touch of lipstick, something I had not done in years. I wanted to look professional. I wanted to look like I belonged. The office manager was a woman named Linda. She was in her early 40s, with short gray hair and glasses on a chain around her neck. She met me at the front desk and shook my hand firmly. She said, "Welcome aboard. We are a small team, but we work hard. We process payroll and accounts for about 40 local businesses. You will be doing data entry. It is straightforward, but it requires attention to detail." I nodded. I said, "I can do that." She led me to a small cubicle in the back. There was a computer, a monitor, a keyboard, and a stack of papers in a tray. She showed me how to log in, how to access the software, how to enter the numbers. She explained the codes and the categories. I tried to listen, but there was so much information. I felt like I was drowning. She said, "Any questions?" I said, "I think I can figure it out." She nodded and left. I sat down in the chair and looked at the screen. I had used a computer before, but not for this kind of work. I had typed recipes and emails and the occasional letter to the newspaper. I had never used accounting software. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to make sense of the columns and the numbers. The other staff members were young. They wore casual clothes and spoke in abbreviations I did not understand. They moved through the office with a speed and confidence that made me feel slow and old. They did not ignore me, exactly, but they did not include me either. They said hello in the mornings and goodbye in the evenings. That was the extent of it. I spent the first day trying to enter the data from the stack of papers. I made mistakes. I put numbers in the wrong columns. I misread the codes. I had to go back and correct everything. By the end of the day, I had only completed a fraction of what I was supposed to. I felt embarrassed and frustrated. Linda came to my cubicle at the end of the day. She looked at my screen and said, "You are falling behind." I said, "I know. I am sorry. I am still learning the system." She said, "I gave you a manual. Did you read it?" I had not. I had been too busy trying to figure things out on my own. I said, "I will read it tonight." She said, "Do that. Tomorrow, I want to see progress." She walked away. I sat in my cubicle and felt the tears coming. I blinked them back. I was not going to cry at work. I was not going to give them that. I packed up my things and left. I drove home in silence, replaying the day in my head. When I got home, Frank was in the living room. The television was on. He said, "How was your first day?" I said, "Fine." He looked at me. He knew I was lying. But he did not push. He said, "Dinner is in the oven." I made a casserole. I said, "Thank you." I went upstairs and changed out of my blouse. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked like someone who had no business working in an accounting office. I splashed water on my face and went back downstairs. We ate dinner in silence. The casserole was dry, but I did not complain. I was too tired to complain. After dinner, I found the manual and sat in the living room and read it. It was dense and technical. I did not understand half of it, but I read it anyway. I read it until my eyes started to blur. The next day, I went back to work. I tried to be faster. I tried to be more accurate. I made fewer mistakes, but I was still slow. Linda came by and said, "Better. But still not enough." I said, "I am trying." She said, "I know you are. But trying is not the same as doing." I felt the sting of her words. I went back to my screen and worked harder. I did not take a lunch break. I did not talk to anyone. I just kept entering numbers, one after another, until my fingers ached. At the end of the second day, I had caught up to about half of what I was supposed to do. It was not enough, but it was something. I went home and cooked dinner for Frank. He asked me how work was. I said, "Better." He said, "Good." That was the extent of our conversation. We had become strangers in our own home. The third day was harder. I had a stack of new papers to enter, and I was still behind on the old ones. I tried to work faster, but my hands started to shake. I made a mistake. A decimal point in the wrong place. I did not realize it until the end of the day, when Linda ran a report and saw the error. She called me into her office. She closed the door. She said, "Ellen, this is a serious mistake. This is a payroll entry. If this had gone through, the client would have been shorted by $5,000. I said, "I am so sorry. I will fix it." She said, "I already fixed it. But I need you to understand. This cannot happen again. Accuracy is more important than speed. If you are not sure, you need to ask." I said, "I understand." She looked at me. Her face softened, just a little. She said, "I know you are trying. I know this is not easy for you. But I need to be able to rely on you." "Can I rely on you?" I said, "Yes. You can." She said, "Good. Then go home and rest. Come back tomorrow and start fresh." I went home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. I did not want to go inside. I did not want to face Frank and his quiet disappointment. I sat there until the sky grew dark and the porch light came on automatically. I went inside. Frank was in the kitchen. He had made dinner again. He said, "You look tired." I said, "I am." He said, "Maybe you should quit. You do not need to work. We can figure something else out." I said, "No. I am not quitting. I am going to make this work." He looked at me with something like pity. He said, "Ellen, you do not have to prove anything to me." I said, "I am not proving anything to you. I am proving something to myself." I went to bed early. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the next day and the day after that. I thought about all the numbers I would have to enter, all the mistakes I might make, all the ways I could fail. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety in my chest. But underneath it, there was something else. Something stubborn. Something that refused to give up. The next day, I did not make any mistakes. I was slow, but I was accurate. Linda came by my cubicle at the end of the day and said, "Good. Keep it up." I felt a small surge of pride. It was not much, but it was something. At the end of the first week, I received my first paycheck. It was small. Minimum wage, part-time hours. I looked at the amount and felt a pang of disappointment. But I folded the check and put it in my purse. It was mine. I had earned it. It was the first money I had made in years, and it felt different than the money Frank brought home. It felt like I had earned it. On Saturday, Claire came over. She brought more brochures. She spread them out on the kitchen table and said, I found a few more options. There is a nice 2-bedroom condo near the park. It has a balcony and a community pool. I think you would love it. I looked at the brochures. I looked at Claire's eager face. I said, Claire, I told you. I am not selling this house. She said, Mom, you cannot afford to keep it. You are working a minimum wage job. Dad is not going to find another job. You are going to lose this place anyway. Why not do it on your own terms, I said, because those terms are not my terms. They are yours. She said, I am trying to help you. I said, I know you are. But you are not listening to me. You are not hearing what I am saying. I want to stay in this house. I am willing to work for it. I am willing to sacrifice for it. I am not going to give it up just because it is easier. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, You are being stubborn. I said, Yes, I am. And that is what is going to get me through this. She gathered up her brochures and left. I watched her go. I felt bad, but I also felt relieved. I had stood my ground. It was a small victory. On Sunday, I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. I said, How are you? He said, Better. I found a lawyer. A pro bono one. She specializes in father's rights. I said, That is wonderful. He said, I have a meeting with her next week. She says I have a good case. Jenna does not have any evidence that I am a bad father. She just has allegations. I said, Do not get your hopes up too high. But do not give up either. He said, I won't. I promise. I felt a small weight lift off my shoulders. Marcus was fighting back. That was more than I had hoped for. On Monday, I went back to work. The second week was easier. I had learned the system. I was faster. I was more confident. Linda came by my cubicle and said, You are improving. I said, Thank you. She said, I have a new project for you. It is a small client, a hardware store. They need their books reconciled for the last quarter. It is a bit more complicated than data entry. Do you think you can handle it? I said, I can try. She handed me a folder. I opened it. It was a stack of receipts and invoices. I took a breath and started to work. It was difficult. I had to look up codes. I had to cross-reference numbers. I had to double-check everything. But I did it. By the end of the week, I had finished the reconciliation. I handed the folder to Linda. She looked through it. She nodded. She said, Good work. I felt a swell of pride. It was not just pride in the work. It was pride in myself. I had done something I did not think I could do. That evening, I told Frank about the project. I told him about the reconciliation. I told him that Linda was pleased. He listened. He said, That is good, Ellen. I am proud of you. I said, Thank you. We sat in the living room and watched television together. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step toward something. Toward normal. Toward us. The third week, I was given another project. Then another. I was no longer just doing data entry. I was doing basic bookkeeping. I was learning. I was growing. The young staff members started to talk to me. They asked me about my weekend. They asked me about my family. They stopped treating me like an outsider. Linda called me into her office at the end of the third week. She said, Ellen, I want to offer you a permanent position. It would be part-time, but it would be a regular schedule. You would get benefits. I was stunned. I said, I do not know what to say. She said, Say yes. I said yes. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile. She said, Good. You have earned it. I walked out of her office feeling lighter than I had in months. I had done it. I had proven myself. It was not a big job. It was not a glamorous job. But it was mine. I drove home with the windows down. The air was warm. The sun was setting. I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt hope. The idea came to me on a Wednesday night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened in the past few months. Frank's letter. Claire's campaign. Marcus's collapse. And then there was the question that had been nagging at me since the beginning. Why had Caldwell done this to him? Frank was a loyal employee. He had never been written up. He had never missed a deadline. He had been promoted twice. It did not add up. I got out of bed and went downstairs. I found Frank's old address book in the desk drawer. I flipped through it until I found the name I was looking for. Harold. Frank's old supervisor. He had retired 2 years ago. He had been a friend to Frank, someone Frank had always spoken well of. If anyone knew the truth about what had happened, it would be him. I called Harold the next morning. He answered on the third ring. His voice was gruff and familiar. I said, Harold, it's Ellen. Frank's wife. There was a pause. Then he said, Ellen. It's been a long time. I said, I know. I'm sorry to call you out of the blue. But I need to ask you something. He said, what about? I said, about Frank. About his job. About what really happened at Caldwell. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know if I'm the right person to talk to about that. I said, Harold, you were his supervisor for 10 years. You knew him better than anyone at that company. If anyone knows what happened, it's you. He let out a long breath. He said, Ellen, I'm retired now. I don't want to get involved in company politics. I said, this is not about company politics. This is about my husband. He is a broken man. He is drinking again. He has lost his sense of purpose. And I need to know why. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, can you meet me somewhere? I don't want to talk about this over the phone. I said, I can be anywhere you want. We agreed to meet at a diner on the other side of town. It was a neutral place, far from both our homes. I drove there that afternoon. The diner was empty except for a few old men at the counter. Harold was sitting in a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was white now, and his face was lined with deep creases. I sat down across from him. He looked at me and said, you look tired, Ellen. I said, I am tired. But I am not going to rest until I know the truth. He nodded. He took a sip of his coffee. He said, what do you want to know? I said, I want to know why Frank was pushed out. I want to know who was behind it. And I want to know if there is anything we can do about it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it wasn't a performance issue. Frank was one of the best accountants I ever worked with. He was meticulous. He was reliable. He never missed a deadline. That was not the problem. I said, then what was the problem? He looked down at his coffee cup. He said, there was a woman. Cynthia. She was a mid-level manager in the logistics division. She had been with the company for about 6 years. She was ambitious. Very ambitious. I said, what did she have to do with Frank? He said, she wanted his job. She had been angling for a promotion for a while, but the position was not open. Frank was in it, and he was not going anywhere. So she decided to make it open. I felt a chill run down my spine. I said, how did she do that? He said, she started by planting doubts. She went to upper management and suggested that Frank's department was not meeting its performance targets. She had data to back it up. But the data was manipulated. She had adjusted the numbers to make it look like Frank was underperforming. I said, how do you know that? He said, because I was the one who reviewed the data. I was his supervisor. I knew his numbers. They did not match what she was presenting. I brought it up to HR, but they said I was being biased. They said I was protecting a friend. I said, did they investigate? He said, they did a cursory investigation. They interviewed Frank. They interviewed Cynthia. They looked at the data. But Cynthia was smart. She covered her tracks. The investigation concluded that there was no wrongdoing. I said, but you knew there was. He said, I knew. But I could not prove it. And I was getting ready to retire. I did not want to leave on bad terms. I made a choice. I let it go. I leaned back in the booth. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I said, Harold, you let a woman destroy my husband's career. You let her lie and manipulate and ruin his reputation. And you did nothing. He looked at me. His eyes were sad. He said, I am not proud of it, Ellen. I have thought about it every day since I retired. I should have fought harder. I should have gone to the board. But I was tired. I was scared. I did not want to be the one who made waves. I said, making waves is what would have saved my husband. He nodded. He said, I know. And I am sorry. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what he had told me. It was not just a lie. It was a carefully constructed deception. Cynthia had planned it, executed it, and gotten away with it. And Frank had been the casualty. I said, Would you be willing to testify to this? Would you be willing to sign a statement? He shook his head. He said, I can't do that, Ellen. I'm retired. I don't want to get dragged into a legal battle. I don't want to go through that stress. I said, Harold, you are the only witness. Without you, there is no case. Without you, Frank will never get justice. He looked at me. He said, I am sorry, Ellen. I really am. But I have my own family to think about. I have my own health. I can't do it. I stood up. I said, I understand. I don't agree with it, but I understand. I walked out of the diner and got into my car. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. I was angry. I was angrier than I had ever been. But I also felt a strange sense of clarity. I knew now what had happened. I knew who had done it. And I knew that I was not going to let it go. I drove home. Frank was in the living room. He was watching television. I sat down next to him. I said, I need to tell you something. He looked at me. He said, what is it? I said, I talked to Harold today. He told me what happened at Caldwell. Frank's face went pale. He said, you talked to Harold? I said, I did. He told me about Cynthia. He told me about the manipulated data. He told me that she framed you. Frank stood up. He walked to the window. He said, I didn't want you to know about that. I said, why not? He said, because it is humiliating. Because it makes me look weak. Because I should have seen it coming. I should have protected myself. I walked over to him. I said, Frank, you did not do anything wrong. You were the victim. She was the one who lied and cheated. You are not weak. You are the one who survived. He turned to me. There were tears in his eyes. He said, I didn't survive, Ellen. I am barely holding on. I took his hands. I said, we are going to get through this. Together. We are going to figure out what to do. He said, what can we do? She won. She got my job. She got my reputation. There is nothing left. I said, there is always something left. And I am not going to let her get away with it. The next day, I called Marcus. I told him what I had learned. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, Mom, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to go to Caldwell. I am going to talk to HR. I am going to demand a full investigation. He said, Mom, that is dangerous. They could make things worse. They could sue you for defamation. I said, I don't care. I am not going to let her destroy your father. I am not going to let her win. He said, I will come with you. I said, no. You need to focus on your own case. You need to fight for Liam. I can handle this on my own. He said, Mom, you don't have to do everything alone. I said, I know. But right now, this is something I need to do for your father. For myself. I need to stand up and fight. I drove to Caldwell Logistics the next morning. The building was a large, glass and steel structure on the outskirts of town. I parked in the visitor lot and walked inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, with a marble floor and a reception desk that looked like it cost more than my house. I approached the receptionist. I said, I need to speak to someone in human resources. She said, do you have an appointment? I said, no. But I am not leaving until I speak to someone. She looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and made a call. She said, someone will be down to see you shortly. I sat in the waiting area and waited. I watched people walk by in suits and heels. They looked busy and important. I felt small and out of place. But I did not leave. After an hour, a woman came down. She was in her late 40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression. She said, I am Diane. I am the Director of Human Resources. How can I help you? I stood up. I said, I am Ellen, Frank's wife. I need to talk to you about what happened to my husband. She looked at me. She said, let's go to my office. We walked to an elevator and rode up to the 3rd floor. Her office was large and impersonal. She gestured for me to sit down. She said, what is this about? I said, my husband was forced out of his job because of a woman named Cynthia. She manipulated performance data to make him look incompetent. She framed him. And your company let her get away with it. Diane leaned back in her chair. She said, we investigated this matter internally and found no wrongdoing. I said, then you did not investigate thoroughly. I have a witness. His old supervisor, Harold. He told me everything. Diane's face did not change. She said, Harold is retired. He is no longer affiliated with this company. I said, that does not make his testimony any less valid. I want you to reopen the investigation. I want you to look at the data again. I want you to talk to Cynthia. Diane said, I cannot do that based on hearsay. I said, then I will go to the media. I will tell them what happened. I will tell them that Caldwell Logistics allowed a senior employee to be railroaded by a junior manager. I will make sure that everyone knows. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, you are making serious accusations. I said, I am making true accusations. And I am not going to stop until someone listens. She stood up. She said, I will look into it. But I cannot promise anything. I said, that is all I am asking. I left the building. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. I had done it. I had spoken up. I had not backed down. When I got home, Frank was waiting for me. He said, where did you go? I said, I went to Caldwell. I talked to HR. I demanded an investigation. He looked at me like I was a stranger. He said, Ellen, you didn't. You can't do that. I said, I already did. He sat down heavily on the couch. He said, they are going to come after us now. They are going to sue us. They are going to destroy us. I said, no, they are not. They are going to listen. And they are going to do the right thing. He shook his head. He said, you don't understand. They don't care about the right thing. They care about protecting themselves. I said, then they will do the right thing to protect themselves. Either way, we win. I sat down next to him. I took his hand. I said, Frank, I am not going to let her take anything else from you. I am not going to let you lose yourself. We are going to fight this, and we are going to win. He looked at me. His eyes were wet. He said, how did you get so strong? I said, I got strong because I had to. Because my family needed me. Because you needed me. And I am not going to let you down. He leaned his head on my shoulder. I held him. We sat there in the darkening living room, together, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were going to be okay. The report arrived in the mail on a Saturday. I had been expecting it, but when I saw the Caldwell Logistics return address on the envelope, my heart still jumped. I carried it into the kitchen and opened it with the letter opener Frank used for bills. The report was thick, bound with a plastic spiral, and filled with dense corporate language. I sat down at the table and started to read. It was thorough, I had to give them that. They had conducted a new investigation, interviewing Harold, reviewing the performance data, and examining the timeline of events. The report concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support the allegations against Cynthia. It stated that the performance metrics in question had been reviewed by multiple managers and that no irregularities were found. It was a whitewash. They had done exactly what I feared they would do. They had protected their own. But there was something else in the report. A footnote, buried in the appendix. It was a reference to an internal audit that had been conducted 6 months before Frank was pushed out. The audit had been requested by someone in the logistics division, and it had raised questions about data integrity in Frank's department. The footnote included a date and a reference number. It did not name anyone. But I knew. I knew it was Cynthia. I called Harold. He answered on the first ring. I said, Harold, I got the report. They cleared her. He said, I figured they would. They always protect their own. I said, but there is a footnote. An internal audit. It was requested by someone in logistics. Do you remember that? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I remember. Cynthia requested it. She said she wanted to ensure the department's processes were up to date. I thought it was suspicious at the time, but I didn't push. I said, that is the link. That is the proof. He said, Ellen, it's not proof. It's a footnote. It doesn't prove anything. I said, it proves she had access. It proves she was involved. And if I can get the full audit report, I can prove she manipulated the data. He said, you can't get that report. It's internal. They won't give it to you. I said, then I will find another way. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the report. I felt a familiar knot of frustration in my chest. I had come so close. I had gotten them to investigate. I had exposed the link. But it was not enough. They had closed the case and Cynthia was still free. Frank came into the kitchen. He saw the report on the table. He said, "Is that from Caldwell?" I said, "Yes." "They cleared her." He nodded. He did not look surprised. He said, "I told you they would." I said, "There is a footnote. An internal audit. Cynthia requested it. I think it contains the evidence we need." He said, "Ellen, let it go. It's over." I said, "It is not over. Not until I get that audit report." He looked at me with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. He said, "You can't. They won't give it to you. And even if you got it, what would you do with it? You're not a lawyer. You're not a detective. You're just my wife." I felt the sting of his words. I said, "I am your wife. That is exactly why I am doing this." He walked out of the kitchen. I sat there alone with the report in front of me. I felt a wave of doubt wash over me. Was I being foolish? Was I chasing something that could never be caught? But then I thought about Cynthia. I thought about the way she had destroyed Frank's career. I thought about the way she had walked away unscathed. I thought about the way Caldwell had protected her. And I felt my resolve harden. I was not going to let it go. I was not going to give up. I spent the next few days trying to find a way to get the audit report. I called the company and asked for a copy. They told me it was confidential. I called the HR director, Diane, and asked her to reconsider. She said she could not release internal documents without a court order. I felt like I was hitting a brick wall. Then I had an idea. It was risky. It was probably foolish. But I did not have any other options. I looked up Cynthia's address online. It was not hard to find. She lived in a new development on the other side of the county, in a house that was probably twice the size of mine. I wrote down the address and put it in my purse. The next morning, I drove to her house. I did not tell Frank. I did not tell anyone. I just got in my car and drove. The development was all identical houses with manicured lawns and two-car garages. Cynthia's house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. I rang the bell. She opened the door. She was not what I expected. She was smaller than I had imagined, with dark hair and sharp eyes. She was wearing yoga pants and a t-shirt. She looked like a regular person. She looked at me with confusion. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "My name is Ellen. I'm Frank's wife." Her face changed. The confusion turned to wariness. She said, "I don't think we have anything to talk about." I said, "I think we do. I think you owe my husband an explanation." She stepped back. She said, "I don't owe him anything." I said, "You manipulated his performance data. You got him fired. You took his job. You owe him everything." She crossed her arms. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "I know about the audit. I know you requested it. I know you used it to make him look incompetent. I know everything." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. She said, "You better come in." I walked into her house. It was clean and modern, with white walls and minimalist furniture. She led me to the living room and gestured for me to sit down. I sat. She sat across from me. She said, "Your husband was a good man. He was a good accountant. But he was old-fashioned. He resisted the new technology. He resisted change. He was a drag on the department." I said, "He was loyal. He was kind. He came in early and stayed late. He was the best employee they had." She said, "Loyalty does not pay the bills. Kindness does not improve the bottom line. The company needed to move forward, and your husband was standing in the way." I said, "So you decided to remove him?" She said, "I decided to help the company. That is what I was paid to do." I felt a cold fury rising in me. I said, "You lied. You manipulated data. You ruined a man's life." She leaned forward. She said, "I did what I had to do to advance my career. Your husband would have done the same thing in my position. Everyone in that company is looking out for themselves. That is how it works." I said, "That is not how it works. That is not how it should work." She leaned back. She said, "I don't expect you to understand. You're not in the business world. You don't know how competitive it is. You don't know what it takes to survive." I said, "I know what it takes to survive. I have been surviving for 58 years. I have raised 2 children. I have kept a marriage together. I have held a family together while everyone around me was falling apart. Do not tell me I do not know what it takes to survive. She looked at me. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am not going to do anything." I wanted to see your face. I wanted to know what kind of person would do what you did. And now I know. You are just a person who made a choice. A bad choice. A selfish choice. And you will have to live with that. I stood up. I walked to the door. She said, "Are you going to tell people?" I turned to her. I said, "No. I am not going to tell anyone. Because it would not change anything. You would still be who you are. And my husband would still be broken. The only difference is I would be broken too." I left. I got in my car and drove away. I did not look back. When I got home, Frank was in the living room. He looked up as I walked in. He said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I went to see Cynthia." He stood up. He said, "You did what?" I said, "I went to her house. I talked to her. She admitted everything. She said she did it to advance her career. She said it was just business." He stared at me. He said, "Ellen, you should not have done that. That was dangerous." I said, "It was not dangerous. She is not dangerous. She is just selfish. She is a person who made a choice, and she will have to live with it." He sat down heavily. He said, "What did she say?" I said, "She said you were old-fashioned. She said you resisted change. She said she was just helping the company." He shook his head. He said, "She was right. I was old-fashioned. I did resist change. I was comfortable with the old ways. I did not want to learn the new systems." I sat down next to him. I said, "That is not a crime, Frank. That is not a reason to destroy someone." He said, "I should have fought harder. I should have defended myself. I just let it happen." I said, "You did what you thought was best. You tried to protect yourself the only way you knew how. That does not make you weak." He looked at me. He said, "You are so strong, Ellen. I don't know how you do it." I said, "I do it because I have to. Because I love you. Because I love our family. And because I am not going to let anyone take that away from us." We sat together in silence. The evening light came through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. I took his hand. I said, "It is over now. I am not going to fight it anymore. I am not going to let her take any more of our time. We are going to move forward." He said, "How do we move forward?" I said, "One step at a time. One day at a time. We start by being here. Together." He nodded. He squeezed my hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. That night, I called Marcus. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, I am proud of you. I don't think I could have done that." I said, "You could have. You are stronger than you think." He said, "I have good news. I met with the lawyer. She thinks I have a strong case. She is going to file a motion for shared custody." I said, "That is wonderful." He said, "I am going to fight for Liam. I am not going to give up." I said, "That is all I ever wanted to hear." We talked for a little while longer. When we hung up, I felt a small spark of hope. Marcus was fighting. Frank was starting to heal. Claire was still a problem, but I would deal with her in time. I went downstairs. Frank was in the kitchen making tea. He looked up and smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. I walked over and stood beside him. I said, "We are going to be okay." He said, "I know. I am starting to believe that." We drank our tea in silence, watching the night through the window. It was not a perfect ending. It was not even a happy ending. But it was an ending. And that was enough. The morning of the moving truck was gray and damp, the kind of day that made everything feel heavy. I woke up before Frank, the way I always did, and I stood at the bedroom window looking out at the yard. The maple tree was shedding its leaves, and they were scattered across the grass like pieces of paper. I watched them for a long time, thinking about all the autumns we had spent in this house, all the leaf piles we had raked, all the Halloweens and Thanksgivings and quiet Sunday afternoons. I went downstairs and started the coffee. The kitchen was full of boxes. Claire had been busy while I was at work. She had come over with her fiancé, Derek, and they had spent the weekend packing. They had labeled everything with a marker, neat and efficient. The boxes were stacked against the walls, waiting to be loaded onto the truck that was scheduled to arrive at noon. Frank came down a few minutes later. He looked tired, but he was dressed. He had put on his good shirt, the one he wore to church. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. He said, "The truck is coming today." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you ready for this?" I said, "No. But I am going to do it anyway." He nodded. He did not argue. He had stopped arguing about the house weeks ago. Claire had worn him down with her facts and figures, her timelines and her strategies. He had signed the papers, and I had not stopped him. I had let him sign because I was tired of fighting. Because I was tired of being the only one who was fighting. But I had not given up. I had just been waiting. I went to the garage and pulled out the box I had hidden behind the old bicycle. It was a small box, filled with letters and photographs and official documents. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table. Frank looked at it. He said, "What is that?" I said, "It is everything I have been working on. The letters I wrote to the board. The copies of the audit. The notes from my conversations with Harold. Everything." He stared at me. He said, "You kept all that?" I said, "I did. I told you I was done fighting. But I was not done preparing." He said, "Ellen, what are you going to do with that?" I said, "I am going to use it. I am going to stop the sale." Just then, Claire came through the back door. She had a key. She always had a key. She was carrying a clipboard and a cup of coffee. She looked at the box on the table. She said, "What's that?" I said, "It is the evidence I have been gathering. Evidence that your father was forced out of his job by a woman who manipulated data and lied to her superiors. Evidence that Caldwell Logistics covered it up." She set down her coffee. She said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" I said, "I am talking about the truth. The truth that your father was not a failure. The truth that he was a victim. The truth that you have been ignoring because it was easier to believe that we were just poor and old and in the way." She looked at Frank. He looked at the floor. She said, "Dad, is this true?" He nodded. He said, "It is true. I did not want to tell you because I was ashamed. But it is true." She turned to me. She said, "What does this have to do with the house?" I said, "Everything. You are selling this house because you think we cannot afford it. But the only reason we cannot afford it is that your father was wrongfully terminated. And I am going to prove that. I am going to take this evidence to the labor board. I am going to file a complaint. And I am going to get the compensation we deserve." She said, "You can't do that. It will take years. It will cost a fortune." I said, "It will cost nothing. I have already done the work. The letters are written. The documents are organized. All I have to do is mail them." She looked at me like I was a stranger. She said, "Mom, you are not a lawyer. You are not a detective. You are a retired housewife who works data entry." I said, "I am a woman who has spent her entire life taking care of her family. And I am not going to stop now." Marcus walked in through the front door. He had driven down from the city the night before. He had his son with him, Liam, who was holding his hand. He looked at the scene in the kitchen. He said, "What is going on?" Claire said, "Mom is trying to stop the sale. She is trying to file a complaint against Dad's old company." Marcus looked at the box. He walked over and opened it. He pulled out a letter and read it. He said, "Mom, this is serious. This is a formal complaint." I said, "I know. I wrote it myself." He said, "You could get the company into a lot of trouble." I said, "Good. They deserve to be in trouble." He put the letter back in the box. He looked at his father. He said, "Dad, did you know about this?" Frank said, "I knew she was gathering evidence. I did not know she was planning to use it." Marcus said, "Mom, are you sure about this? Once you send these letters, there is no going back. The company will fight you. They have lawyers. They have money. They will make your life difficult." I said, "I know. But I am not afraid of them. I have been afraid for too long. I am done being afraid." Claire said, "This is insane. This is going to ruin us. We will be in litigation for years. We will lose everything." I said, "We have already lost everything. Your father lost his job, his reputation, his sense of purpose. I lost my sense of peace. Marcus lost his family. And you, Claire, you lost your way. You became a stranger to us, to yourself. We have nothing left to lose." She was silent. She looked at the floor. She said, "I was just trying to help." I said, "I know. But you were not helping. You were taking over. You were making decisions for us without asking us. You were treating us like children." She started to cry. She said, "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to fix things. I wanted to make everything better." I walked over to her. I put my hand on her shoulder. I said, "I know you did. But fixing things is not the same as being there. Being there means listening. Being there means asking. Being there means being present. You were not present, Claire. You were just busy." She looked up at me. She said, "I am sorry, Mom." I said, "I know you are. And I forgive you. But we need to stop this sale. We need to figure out a different way." She nodded. She said, "I will call the realtor. I will cancel the truck." She went into the living room to make the call. I turned to Marcus. He was holding Liam's hand. He said, "Mom, I think you are doing the right thing." I said, "I hope so." He said, "I know so." Frank walked over to me. He took my hands. He said, "Ellen, I don't know what to say." I said, "You do not have to say anything. You just have to be here. That is all I have ever wanted." He pulled me into a hug. It was the first time he had hugged me in months. I held on to him and felt the tears coming. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. The moving truck never came. Claire canceled it. The realtor called and asked if everything was all right. Claire told her that we were not going to sell the house. The realtor was not happy, but she did not argue. She said she would send a bill for her time. I mailed the letters the next day. I sent them to the labor board, to the company's board of directors, and to a lawyer I had found who specialized in employment law. It was a risk. But I had decided that the risk was worth it. A few weeks later, I received a response. The labor board was going to investigate. The company had offered a settlement. It was not a huge amount. It would not make us rich. But it was enough. Enough to pay off the mortgage. Enough to give Frank some dignity. Enough to show that we had not been forgotten. Frank accepted the settlement. He did not fight it. He said he was tired of fighting. I did not blame him. He had been fighting for too long. Marcus won his custody case. The judge ruled that he and Jenna would share custody of Liam. It was not a victory exactly. It was a compromise. But it meant that Marcus would see his son every other weekend and during the holidays. That was enough. Claire called off her engagement. She said she needed time to figure things out. She said Derek was not the right person for her. I did not ask why. I just listened. The house stayed. We stayed. We did not move. We did not downsize. We just stayed. On a Sunday morning, a few months later, I was in the kitchen making cinnamon rolls. The recipe was the same one I had used for years. The kitchen was warm and smelled like yeast and sugar. Frank was in the living room reading the newspaper. Marcus was in the backyard with Liam, kicking a soccer ball. Claire was asleep on the couch, still in her pajamas. I looked around the kitchen. The counters were cluttered. The dishes were not done. The floor was sticky. It was not a perfect house. It never had been. But it was our house. And we were still here. I called out, "Breakfast is almost ready." Frank came into the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He said, "They smell good." I said, "They always smell good." He smiled. It was a real smile, the kind I had not seen in a long time. He said, "I am glad we stayed." I said, "Me too." Marcus came in with Liam. They were both covered in grass stains and laughing. Marcus said, "Mom, Liam wants to learn how to make cinnamon rolls." I said, "Then he will learn. That is what grandmothers are for." Liam climbed onto a chair and looked at the dough. I showed him how to punch it down. He punched it with both fists. He laughed. I laughed. Claire woke up and came into the kitchen. She looked at the scene. She said, "It is a full house." I said, "It is." She said, "I am sorry for everything." I said, "I know. But we are not going to talk about that today. We are going to eat breakfast." We sat around the table. The cinnamon rolls were warm and sticky. The coffee was hot. The windows were open, letting in the cool autumn air. We talked about nothing important. The weather. The leaves. Liam's soccer game. It was ordinary. It was normal. It was everything. After breakfast, Frank and I sat on the back porch. The yard was full of leaves. He said, I am going to have to rake those. I said, not today. He said, when? I said, tomorrow. Or the day after. They are not going anywhere. He leaned back in his chair. He said, you were right, Ellen. About everything. I said, I was not right. I was just stubborn. He laughed. It was a real laugh. He said that too. We sat there together, watching the leaves fall. The sky was clear. The air was crisp. It was not a perfect life. It was not a perfect ending. But it was ours. And we were going to make the most of it. I looked at Frank. I looked at the house. I looked at the yard. I thought about all the years we had spent here, all the struggles and the joys. I thought about the future, uncertain and full of possibility. I did not know what was going to happen next. But I knew that we would face it together. And that was enough. The leaves were gone now, and the first frost had come. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the morning light spread across the yard. The maple tree was bare, its branches reaching up like old hands. I was 60 now. I had not planned to live this long, not really. But here I was, still standing, still cooking, still holding my family together. Frank came down the stairs. He was slower than he used to be, but he was steadier. He had stopped drinking. He had started walking every morning. He had even started talking about volunteering at the community center. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood beside me at the window. He said, it's cold out there. I said, it's December. He said, I know. But I was thinking we could go for a drive later. Maybe see the lights. I looked at him. He was not the same man who had signed the papers for the realtor. He was not the same man who had hidden in his armchair and let the world close in on him. He was older, yes. But he was here. Present. That was all I had ever wanted. Marcus called. He said Liam was with him for the weekend. They had built a fort in the living room, and Liam was already asleep in it. He said Jenna had agreed to let him have Liam for Thanksgiving. I told him that was wonderful. He said, Mom, you did that. You showed me that I could fight. I said, no, Marcus. You did that. I just reminded you who you were. Claire came by in the afternoon. She brought groceries and a bottle of wine. She had been coming more often lately, not with plans or agendas, just to sit and talk. She told me she had started seeing a therapist. She said she was learning to listen. I did not say anything. I just nodded and put the groceries away. That evening, we sat in the living room. The fire was lit. Liam was on the floor with his toys. Marcus was on the couch. Claire was in the armchair. Frank was in his usual spot. I looked at all of them. They were not perfect. They were messy and complicated and sometimes frustrating. But they were mine. And I was theirs. I thought about everything that had happened. The lies and the betrayals. The fights and the tears. The long nights and the harder mornings. I thought about Cynthia and her cold ambition. I thought about Caldwell and their slick reports. I thought about Harold and his silence. They had all tried to break us. But we were still here. The fire crackled. Liam laughed at something on the television. Marcus reached over and tousled his son's hair. Claire said something that made Frank laugh. It was a small moment. It was just a Thursday night in December. But it was everything. I leaned back in my chair. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if Frank would ever fully recover. I did not know if Marcus would ever get Jenna back. I did not know if Claire would ever find the peace she was looking for. But I did not need to know. What I needed was right here. The warmth of the fire. The sound of my family. The knowledge that we had survived. And that was enough.